Welcome to Just Settled. On today's podcast from Camino Law, we have Abigail Seymour and Rebecca Perry, two incredible family lawyers out of Greensboro, North Carolina. Welcome to the show, Rebecca and Abigail.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Heard amazing things about Camino Law. Awesome law firm. If you need anything for divorce, custody, surrogacy, any services for family law, Camino Law can help you in Greensboro and North Carolina. Want to share your settlement success stories? Join us as a guest on the Just Settled podcast. Visit our Instagram at Just Settled Case and click on the link at the top of the page to set up your interview today. Abigail, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. And yeah, you were telling me a little bit about a very interesting case recently that I do want to dive into. Before we get there, I just kind of want to give a little bit of background on you and your firm. And I know that you just released a new book in March, Law Mom. So I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about that and just kind of about you and the law firm in general there in Greensboro.
Sure. I actually came to the law later in life. I didn't go to law school until I was 47. And I was a photographer for about most of my career, doing editorial and weddings and things like that. So now I do divorces, which is kind of funny. But I was also a writer, a freelance writer. And so I had written some essays. I did some editorial photography for publications like the New York Times and Martha Stewart Living. And so this was just a huge shift for me to go into, but I'd always been an entrepreneur. And so once I passed the bar, I worked for another firm for just about 6 months and then decided to go out on my own. And it's all women. We have 12 staff members now. We've grown since we started in 2019 with just myself and a paralegal. And now we have 5 attorneys and 7 staff. So it's wonderful. So we love it. And yeah.
And then is the book just about sort of managing work-life balance?
So the book is a series. There are 8 writers in that book. So I didn't actually author the book, but I'm one of the contributors. And it was published by a small publishing house in Texas. And it was just for exactly that, balancing motherhood, ambition. And so my essay is about the fact that I had 2 young children when I was in law school, one of whom had a lot of emotional problems, and kind of navigating that and the struggles that mothers have in choosing home versus career and having to, unfortunately, make that choice sometimes, and what we do for love of work, but also love of family. So, but all the essays, some of them are humorous, some of them are more serious, and it was just really fun to be part of it.
Yeah, so I mean, we can kind of dive in now, I guess, to the case and talk a little bit about what we were discussing earlier. You guys handle a lot of different aspects of family law there, from divorce, as you mentioned, and then child custody and surrogacy and all these things. So I kind of want to dive in here. This specific case you were telling me about earlier, can you kind of give a brief overview of it, or just really how you first learned about it, how it kind of came across your desk, and what your initial thoughts were when you heard the details of this?
Sure. It's a very special case to me. I believe it was one of the first cases on which I was hired when I was just by myself in a little corporate office. And it was a woman came into my office, and I remember she had a big scar on her neck, young woman. And basically she has explained that she had been incarcerated and had been given birth to her child in jail. Actually in prison. She'd already been sentenced and had been a very serious heroin addict and had been in prison for trafficking. And she got out, and during the time she was in prison, her aunt had taken custody of her child. And a lot of those types of cases are informal because a lot of grandparents or kinship care, there's no custody order or anything like that. And so this was an actual custody order. The Department of Social Services was involved, and there was a transfer of custody to this aunt. And now this young woman wanted to switch it out to give custody back to herself. And it was just a very moving case. I worked with her, ended up being a 5-year-long case. It was one of those cases where it didn't start out to be a pro bono case, but it sort of grew into one by choice. And she just became a miracle, and it continues to be a miracle because they're not always happy endings when you've got somebody addicted to opiates. It doesn't always end well. But she hung in there, and they settled the case ultimately And sort of, with family cases, settlement is really the best way to go because you're really talking about relationships being torn apart. It's very Shakespearean sometimes. You're talking about parents choosing grandchildren over their own children and things like that. So in this case, she was continuing to improve so much. It was just one of these things where you really need to show the court that someone has made a substantial change in their circumstances. That's the legal standard. And she was sort of the definition of that. She was clean and sober. She was working. She got remarried. She had another baby after this one. This one was now a toddler, and still technically on paper, this child was in the custody of the aunt. And it was heartbreaking. It was really frustrating because the system was slow. It was during COVID. But to her great credit, she just hung in there and really tried to continue to repair that relationship because it's not the kind of thing you want to have to go to trial over. We really try not to litigate over children. So they ultimately were able to settle, and she got her rights back as a mother.
Okay.
Um, and I'll just say one thing. I usually do those cases. I'm usually on the other side. I tend to represent grandparents because there is the heartbreak of people becoming addicted or dying of overdose and leaving children behind.
Yeah.
And those grandparents are very bereft and they need help, they need guidance. So it was very helpful for me to be on the other side as well and to really understand both sides of those types of cases, to have empathy for both sides.
Right. Yeah. Getting that kind of shift in perspective and different lens, different lens into it, I'm sure was, an interesting experience. Obviously, I would imagine there was a lot of concerns and uncertainties about this case's potential outcome. Can you kind of dive into some of the, in a little bit more granular detail, what some of those were from your angle where you said, okay, this is going to be a specific challenge or
Well,
something you were may have been worried about during the case?
Certainly when I just first met her, you of course want the best for people. And when they say, I'm clean and sober, you hope they are. And the hope is that they will continue to be, but there's always the risk in a case like that where you're fighting for somebody that they relapse and ruin basically their chances for regaining what they were really fighting for. And so that was a challenge. Excuse me, but I knew she was really working at it. She was sending me, her updates and her drug tests, and she was very invested in her case, and therefore I was too, of course. But she was a great co-participant. It was easy to fight for her because she was really fighting for herself too. But as far as those challenges, you just can't predict. And you have to help the client understand, I can do as much as I can, but this case is really resting in your hands because it's all about your choices, and you're continuing to recover and be healthy.
And you said it was 5 years from start to finish in this case. And I would imagine you mentioned COVID. Obviously, that kind of, I'm sure, slowed things down in general across the board for cases like this, right?
Oh, I know a good wrinkle that did happen in the middle of all this. What does happen sometimes, we had a spate of these cases. There was an attorney who was doing them for the Department of Social Services. And in order to expedite a case like this, and if you can picture it, literally, you've got an attorney in jail trying to help this woman sign a consent order to give her child to somebody to keep it out of foster care.
Right.
But in order to do that, legally speaking, you really need to include the father because he's a necessary party, of course. In this particular case, and I was a very new attorney, it said in the pleadings that it named him. It said the father, I think it said the father's unknown, actually. And so really it was just a case between the plaintiff, the aunt, and my client, the defendant, the mother. And so the case moved forward, and we finally got to where we were going to actually have a trial. And we were sitting in front of the judge, a wonderful judge in our county, and she said to my client, as we were sitting there, she said, it says here the father's unknown. Do you know where he is? And she said, yeah, I know him. And he lives somewhere in Chicago. And it was as if I could hear a record scratch because I realized, oh my gosh, we have to start all over again because we could not proceed without adding him as a defendant. So that did slow us down quite a bit. And it was so hard to explain that to her, and also that I had missed it. And a colleague of mine had missed it, and a lot of other people had in other cases. So it was fixable, but it slowed us way down. We had to then find him and serve him and bring him into the case.
Yeah, I would imagine. I didn't think about that, but that is obviously a whole other angle that, I would imagine, you know, just locating the person and getting them to come and all of that. Um, Obviously the client wanted to get her child back. That was the aim here. And you said, I think that did happen, which is incredible. At which point during that timeline, did you realize that was sort of tipping in your favor and you were saying, oh, this is starting to look good. It's starting to look like, we actually may be able to get custody back for your client?
I believe it was around Easter one year, one of those years, she basically told me, yeah, that her aunt had dropped the child off and kind of left her there.
Oh.
And so that was not only a sign that she really trusted her, as she should have, but that the aunt trusted her now, but also just that she was sort of relenting in her own way. And so at a certain point, that becomes a status quo issue because you can show the court that the child's clearly safe and happy with her mother and that the custodial person has relinquished basically. And so I think that was a big turning point. That was where it was really clear that we were going to be able to work this out because all parties were pretty much on the same page.
Yeah, that actually dovetails into my next question because I was going to ask if there was sort of like not a negotiation, but sort of, I guess, a struggle or a conflict over this. Like, what did that pushback look like? How did you kind of advocate for your client's interest? You mentioned showing improvement and obviously proving that she was healthy and in a good emotional and in a good state for the child where it was a safe environment. But how did you kind of go about showing that or proving that and kind of making sure that you were advocating in a way that was, tangible or clear to the judge where they could say, okay, I can see this?
Well, first of all, the other party did actually go through two attorneys, and so because certainly when there are two attorneys on in the case, it's a lot easier to negotiate and work something out because
Yeah.
it's so much easier to explain things. So
Right.
the very first time we came up with a plan in a case like that, you often do like what's called a step up, where you start with supervised visits and then you can move to a more lenient schedule, which is a pretty very reasonable thing to do. And this was pretty early on, so she was maybe a year out of jail and a year sober prison. And but we negotiated something, and then I remember this very well. The nice attorney on the other side said to the judge, it was the end of the day, said, listen, Your Honor, we're going to just speak these terms on the record, and then we're going to memorialize it in a writing with a little bit more time because it's late in the day. And so he put the terms of the order on record in the recording. And then the next day I found out that the opposing party had fired him. So we had no order because just saying it on the record does not count. So all of a sudden we were right back to square one, that the aunt had not been in agreement with whatever we had negotiated. So that was a bit of a setback. And then she got another attorney. We were able to work some things out. So there was pushback just, and again, I think everybody's motives in a thing like this were really to protect the child. I understand where the aunt's coming from. It took her a long time to regain the trust that she had to have in her niece, and it was just a long process. But when it finally does become clear that somebody really is doing and living the way they say they are, it becomes undeniable, and it's just clear that her rights were being restored by she had restored them herself, and that was what she needed to prove.
Yeah, that's incredible. It's really is an amazing story of sort of resilience and, fighting for obviously something that was genuinely the deep purpose and a deep meaning for her. You said that at the end of this that she did get full custody back of her child, and obviously the positive impact of that, I'm sure, was, enormous. But can you kind of speak to that a little bit of like sort of the after, the after everything kind of finalized? What did that look like? How are things now? What's kind of the
Well,
end of the story here?
I received an invitation from her the other day to her graduation because she just got her certificate in substance abuse counseling.
Oh,
So
that's so cool.
she's now helping other people. She's involved in a task force that we have in our area that's all about reallocating the funds that are being distributed from the big settlements.
Interesting.
So she's just an incredible woman. But she, like I said, she has another child. She stops by the office. We get Christmas cards from her. And from what I understand, then, the aunt is her aunt again. I mean, it's not all happy, sunshiny at the end, but I think that relationship has repaired. And I know that from our client's perspective, she really did understand. She was as frustrating as it was. She understood that it was because she loved the child. That the aunt wasn't trying to hurt her. She was trying to protect her child from something she didn't really understand. And
Right.
being able to forgive one another on something like that is very, very, very unique, I think.
Yeah. It was interesting. You mentioned the allocation of that opioid settlement fund. I was just watching, I don't know if you saw this week, but on HBO, there's not real time, sorry. John Oliver has like a show last week tonight. And actually he did a whole like 15-minute segment on exactly that, this like $50 billion opioid settlement and how those funds are being allocated and which states are being transparent about where the funds are going. It was a pretty interesting expose
It,
about exactly that, where, how they were kind of using these funds and, to ideally affect change in a positive way for people that have been impacted. So
yeah, it's fascinating. I'm on the same task force, and so it's really great. It's great to see the community coming together and really trying to, come up with a unified vision of what to do with this money. I mean, it's being meted out pretty slowly, so it's not like a big bag of money falling on people's heads, but it is going to be used for good, I think.
yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, thank you again so much, Abigail, for joining us here today. Again, everybody, Abigail Seymour, incredible family attorney, as we just witnessed here in Greensboro, North Carolina. Check out her new book, Law Moms. And yeah, again, I hope we have you back on the show if you're free in the coming months.
Thank you so much.
In today's digital landscape, a strong social media presence holds significant importance for legal professionals. Recognizing this need, Practice 360 by LegalSoft is pleased to announce an exclusive promotion offering a comprehensive law practice social media solution free of charge for 30 days. Practice 360 is the all-in-one solution to elevate your law firm. Access a suite of services, including personalized mobile apps, website development, PR, and social media management. With everything centralized, say goodbye to juggling multiple providers. Elevate your firm's success with Practice 360 today. Welcome to Just Settled. On today's podcast, we have Rebecca Perry, incredible family lawyer out of Greensboro, North Carolina. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. And yeah, you were telling me a lot about this very interesting surrogacy case, which we have not covered before on the show. So this is a really interesting new angle, something I'm not so familiar with. And I kind of want you to dive into some of the details about it. How did you first learn about this case, or how did it first, I guess, come across your desk? And what were your thoughts when you first heard about, what agreement you were going to have to put together and those types of things?
Well, surrogacy cases are, they start out as agreements before they become legal issues. The parties have come to an agreement about, if somebody's going to carry a child for the intended parent. Okay, there's terms here. Intended parent are the people who are going to raise the child as their own. And then there's a gestational carrier or surrogate who is going to, be impregnated, usually with an embryo that's been created in vitro, and carry that child to delivery and then hand it over. So there's an agreement beforehand. So it's different than a case where there's a dispute between parties and they come to an agreement along the way. So that's, one thing to understand a little bit about before we dive into this. But the case I'm going to talk about is one where there were twin sisters. One had a child who was, approaching adulthood. The other had cancer, as a probably young adult, and could not have children. She was married, and she and her husband both really wanted children, and they had investigated different options, and they wanted, to try surrogacy, but as you probably can guess, it's can be prohibitively expensive because of the medical cost. And they didn't have an insurance policy that would cover surrogacy. As time went on, I believe that twin sister got a different job, and she was able to, it had coverage for the surrogacy. So they were able to pursue that. And so her twin sister actually volunteered to carry the baby for her. And they came to me to work out the terms of a legal document, a contract, setting out the terms of their agreement that, the sister would be implanted with an embryo created from husband's genetic material and a donor egg in vitro. And she would carry the baby and then turn it over to her sister and her husband. And then we worked out the terms of that agreement. Sometimes there's compensation paid to a surrogate for the pain, suffering, inconvenience, stuff that accompanies pregnancy. This case did not have that. They were, sisters and very close, twin sisters. And so there was no compensation exchanged. But we still had to have a written agreement because the IVF or the in vitro physician want that before they proceed. They want to be sure everybody's on the same page, and this is truly somebody's agreement, or both parties' agreement, all parties' agreement. So I worked up the contract, and we got that signed, and then they went through with the procedure. I think it went through pretty. I think it happened on the first time. Her twin became pregnant and carried the baby. About in most surrogacy cases, all of them that I'm involved in North Carolina, it's sort of a two-step process. You do the contract agreement between the parties to lay out all their terms of their agreement with each other. And then somewhere along around after the first trimester, we do what's called a pre-birth order, which is the process of obtaining a court order to get the intended parents' names on the birth certificate and extinguish parental rights of the birth mother and her husband if she has one, and also instructing the hospital to treat intended parents as the birth parents, let them, get into the nursery, see the baby, name the baby, hold the baby, make medical decisions for the baby if needed. And so we've got to have that in place before the baby's born, ideally. So we went through, again, another legal process with these folks, and it was easy because everybody was in agreement. I mean, that's usually the case with surrogacy. Sometimes there's some finer details to work out, but these two women were very much in sync on what they wanted and how it would happen. And so we got that those documents filed, had a judge sign off on the order ordering North Carolina Vital Records to put intended parents' names on the birth certificate. And that's really kind of the end of the legal process. The baby was born. They had a beautiful little boy, and I'm Facebook friends with the intended parents. Well, actually, the intended parent and the carrier. And so, I've watched this little boy grow up. He's only about 3 now, so, but it's fun. It's fun to see them. Well, it came across my desk, sort of by accident, really. I had a website and describe, that I do this kind of work. There aren't a ton of attorneys that do this because it's fairly new practice area. The technology is fairly new, and terms of legal proceedings, it's kind of new. So I guess the twins were looking for an attorney to do this because the physician requires a written agreement. And so they searched the internet and, found my website, my name. And one of the girls, the carrier or surrogate, actually worked right down the hall from me. So she knew my name. She was a paralegal for another attorney. And I had had some cases with that attorney, so she knew me. And so that's how they ended up coming to me.
Gotcha. Okay. And were there any concerns or uncertainties at all when you were first hearing about this, or were you kind of like, this should be relatively smooth sailing? Did you foresee any potential challenges with this case that you were going to, be working on?
Well, there's always the potential for the train to leave the track, First of all, there's no statutory law in North Carolina with respect to this type of arrangement. Many states do have adopted statutes to outline what the procedures are, but North Carolina is not one of them. So this is just the way we have, and by we, I mean North Carolina lawyers who practice in this area. We followed what other states have done. There's a Uniform Parentage Act that a lot of states have adopted, and we follow those procedures and guidelines, but there's no absolute law in North Carolina. So it's kind of a question as to what a court would do if faced with a dispute. So that's in the background. Yeah. With this particular case, I didn't really have huge concerns about that because everyone was on board and they all wanted the same thing, which is most often the case with a surrogacy situation. But aside from the legal concern, there's always, in the back of my mind, a concern that somebody's going to change their mind and not want to give up the baby, or, circumstances change and they're unable to take the child or something like that. And so, that's always a sort of distant concern.
Right. But it sounds like in this case, obviously everything ended up working out really well. And like you said, now the child is 3, I think you said, and that's amazing that it was such an incredible experience for, everybody involved that they got.
Yeah, it was such a gift for twin sister to be able to give to the other, because they are so close. And I think the one who carried the child was as invested in, completing her sister's family with a child as her sister was.
Well, again, thank you so much for joining us today, Rebecca, and sharing this story with us. It was really interesting. And again, anybody who needs an incredible family lawyer in Greensboro, North Carolina, Rebecca Perry, reach out to her. She really helped these people. And we appreciate you joining the show today and telling us all about it.